How do you analyze patent infringement? This may seem daunting, but we can break it down into steps. In particular, I would suggest that there are 4 steps before you conclude whether or not there is infringement. The first is to look to see if there is infringing activity. So, for example, is someone making, using, selling, offering to sell, or importing the patented invention, i.e. one of the claims of the patent. So if you have one of those things, then you can continue on to see if the allegedly infringing activity is actually infringing. Okay, so the first step is to construe, i.e. fancy word for interpret, the elements of the patent claim you're looking at. In other words, you would evaluate the claim elements in light of the specification, the other claims, prosecution history to interpret what they mean to someone of skill in the art. Now, once you have properly interpreted your claim, which should look different than the original claim, it's not just the same elements because you have defined terms, then you compare that with the infringer's product or process to see if every single element is there, and to see if it's there either, quote, literally, the exact same thing, or through doctrine of equivalence, which is a fancy word that basically means something really, really close, even though it's not identical. In particular, the insubstantial change usually requires that the thing performs the same function in the same way and achieves the same result. 3 things that have to all be the same. So for example, if you're talking about a way of connecting things, like a zipper, you might think that a button would be equivalent, but it actually isn't under this test, because a button, although it still is holding things together as a zipper, it does it in a different way. So, when you have a zipper, there's no gaps at all, but that's not true with a button. So even if the result is sort of similar, it's not the same, different way. Any one of these things being different means it's not going to work under doctrine of equivalence. But if you have every single element, then you could possibly infringe. Now let's look at an example. Oh, actually, before we get to an example, let's talk a little bit more about claim construction. So we've talked about the elements and interpreting them, but there is one more key part of claim construction. That's the transition word. Now there's 2 options. One is consisting, which means exactly the same. So I have a picture of what I think are identical twins, so exactly the same. Now the other transition word that you could have is comprising. A widget comprising A, B, C means it has at least A, B, C. So if you have a widget with A, B, C, and D, that is still infringing. But if your widget was consisting of A, B, C, and you had A, B, C, D, that is not infringing. So hopefully you see how the transition word is important. To give you an image to help remember, comprising, I like the greater or equal than, right? So it could be exactly what's written, but it can also be more. So beware of claims that say comprising, because you can have more elements and yet still infringe. So obviously the transition word is just part of it. Also the elements will matter. So let's look at an example. So on the left, there are all the elements of a claim on a method of swinging on a swing. And it says a method comprising the steps of, which on the right we have construed, i.e. interpreted, to mean at least the following steps. The other thing I did in looking at each element is I took the literal words and I tried to put them in some form that was easier to understand. Now this claim is not too complicated. Sometimes it's more complicated, but still, whereas it says suspending a seat for supporting a user between 2 chains that are hung from a tree branch, I have a suspended seat with 2 chains hung from a tree branch. So let's look at some of the images I have here. This tire swing, obviously you could swing on it, but there is only one rope, not a chain. So this is going to fail the first element already. Even though it says comprising, we're missing the first element, can't infringe. You might think, oh, doctrine of equivalence, but then is one strand, even if this was a chain, functioning in the same way result as two? I'm pretty sure not. If you've ever swung on a tire swing with one chain, you know it's less stable than with two. So I'd say it's not. Now look at this swing here. You have two chains and a suspended seat, but it's hung not from a tree branch. Now you might be like, well, it's basically the same thing, but it is not literally the same. For doctrine of equivalence, which is the only way you can comply with this element, you would have to ask, is this metal bar functioning in the same way with the same result and as a tree branch? It's sort of the same, but is it actually? It's closer than the tire, but not quite. Now let's look at this image here. So assuming this was from a tree branch, this is a suspended seat. Now let's say this is 4 chains. Do we now have all the elements? If you're thinking no, you might have forgotten that this says at least. So that means you could have 2 or 3 or 4 or 10. So this would seem to work, but there are more elements. Right now there's no infringement because it's a method of swinging, so you need a user on the seat, and the user has to be perpendicular to the tree, and the user has to pull on one chain and then the other to create movement. So until someone sits on there and is doing that, there is no infringement. Just this picture alone is not infringing. Hopefully that helps to give a little bit of an idea of how you analyze patent infringement.